Random House Audio presents Black Creek Crossing by John Saul. Read for you by Meriweather.
It was the cold that awakened her. A cold that crept first into her sleep, curling its fingers around her subconscious, making her feel as if she were walking through the woods on a winter night. Snow crunched beneath her feet, and all around her the bare limbs of trees glistened in the moonlight, every branch and twig encased in ice. The path wound through a stand of birches, and she was striding along with the careless exhilaration of a spring afternoon, rather than the sense of purposeful urgency that winter nights always brought. Then, as the cold tightened its grip, the dream began to change. A cloud scudded across the moon and the stars began to fade. The woman instinctively reached to pull her shawl tighter around her throat and shoulders, but all her fingers closed on was the thin flannel of her nightgown. Why wasn't she dressed? She hurried her step, and only now realized she was barefoot, and the cold of the snow beneath her feet was numbing her toes. She quickened her pace again, intent on reaching home before frostbite began eating at her flesh. But now the path seemed to be vanishing from beneath her feet. The moonlight had disappeared, and the stars were gone. She turned, searching first in one direction, then in another, but everywhere she looked the snow was unbroken, as if she'd been dropped from nowhere into this dark and freezing wilderness. Her heart began to pound, and she felt a wave of panic rise within her. She tried to run, but her feet seemed mired in the snow as surely as if it had turned into the thick muck of the marsh behind the house. The cold tightened its grip, and she shivered, her whole body trembling, and once again her fingers reached toward her breast to pull the flannel of her nightgown more closely around her. The nightgown was gone. She was naked, and she was no longer alone. Somewhere in the darkness, somewhere just beyond the limits of her vision, there was something. Something that was hunting. Hunting for her. Though the cold was now threatening to numb her body as the snow had numbed her feet, she began running. Too late. Everything was closing in on her. The cold was reaching into her bones, the snow was sucking at her feet, the blackness of the night was all but complete, and the trees themselves were reaching out, scratching at her skin. She sank to her knees, sobbing, and was reaching out, stretching her arms as if in supplication, when a blow from behind struck her back. Searing pain shot through her, and she pitched forward, sprawling out, and at last a scream erupted from her throat. And she woke up. For a moment she lay still, gasping for breath, trying to shake the last of the nightmare from her still reeling mind. The memory of the forest began to fade, and the grasping limbs and twigs of the trees retreated. But the sense that she was not alone was stronger than ever. "I'm asleep," she told herself. "I'm still asleep, and this is only part of the nightmare." Then she heard something. Breathing. Not the slow and steady breathing of a sleeping bedmate, nor the heavy breath of a lover. No, this was the breath of an exultant beast, panting in rapture over its fallen prey. And as she lay on the bed trying to clear her mind and gather her wits, she knew with growing certainty that it was already too late. The agony that was spreading through her body told her the predator had already struck. Now, still lying face down, she heard a slight change in the predator's breathing, felt it gathering itself together, felt it coiling, readying itself to strike again. She had to do something, had to throw herself off the bed, had to escape from the room, escape from the house, escape from the predator. The thought was cut off as she felt another blow strike her back, another flash of pain sear her body. A scream rose in her throat and erupted into the darkness, and finally she threw herself over, struggling to flee from the bed and the attacker and the room and the house. But as she twisted around, Her eyes locked onto the face that loomed above her. "No!" she cried. But even though she screamed the word as loudly as she could, her voice was already reduced to a rattling gasp. Then, above the face, the knife in the man's hand caught the moonlight, and for a moment that seemed like an eternity, it hovered above her, glowing darkly in her own blood. "No," she said again, but this time the word was nothing more than a weak plea, and even as it died in the night, the knife began to descend. She watched it arc toward her, her eyes following the blade as it sank into her breast. For a second she felt nothing more than the heaviness of the blow as the fist that clutched the knife struck her chest. It wasn't until the knife was once more yanked free of her flesh that the searing heat struck too. "No," she sighed once more as the knife rose high yet again. This time she felt nothing as the blade plunged into her, for already her spirit had escaped her body. Now she thought only of another, her daughter, her little girl, the child she could no longer protect. Too late. Too late. The eternal darkness swallowed her soul as her husband finished his grisly task. As the last bell of the day rang, Angel Sullivan sat quietly in her seat in the last row of Mr. English's room and waited for her classmates to disappear before she even started stowing her books in her backpack. Finally, when the chatter in the corridor outside the room had died down, she stood up and began pulling on her jacket. "You okay, Angel?" the teacher asked, peering worriedly at her from his position behind his desk. "Okay," she repeated silently to herself. How could she be okay after what had happened this morning? And if Mr. English didn't know what was wrong, how was she going to explain it to him? After all, it had been right here in this classroom that it had happened, when Mr. English himself had waited until just before the first period bell to ask the class if they wanted to sing Happy Birthday to her. Happy birthday, like it was still third grade or something. Didn't he know that hardly any of her classmates even spoke to her, let alone wanted to sing to her? So there she'd sat in her seat in the last row, feeling her face burning with embarrassment as a horrible silence fell over the room and half the class turned to stare at her. The only thing that had saved her from bursting into tears of humiliation was that the bell had rung and everybody had rushed for the door before their teacher could stop them. Now he wanted to know if she was okay. Biting her lip but saying nothing, she hurried toward the door and the safety of the corridor beyond, which, with any luck at all, would now be empty. "Angel?" she heard Mr. English calling again, but before he could say anything else, she was out of the room, the door swinging shut behind her. Angel. What kind of a name was Angel? For a long time, well, maybe not all that long, but for a while anyway, Angel Sullivan had thought hers was a wonderful name. Maybe the most wonderful name in the world. Even now, memories of phrases from the time when she was barely more than a baby echoed softly in her mind. Daddy's little angel. Mommy's little angel. Grammy's perfect little angel. It had been Grammy who had given her the very first Halloween costume she could remember. It was a white dress that Angel was certain had been made of satin, but which her mother insisted had only been cheap muslin. But it didn't matter, because it had white sequins sewn all over it that glittered even when she was standing as still as she possibly could. On the back of the dress were 2 wings that Grammy had made of papier-mâché and then covered with white feathers. "I've been saving them ever since you were born," Grammy had told her as she carefully fitted the wings onto Angel's tiny 3-year-old shoulders. "Some people might tell you they're only seagull feathers, but don't you believe them." Angel still had those wings, but they no longer hung on the wall of her room like they once had. Now they were wrapped in tissue paper and packed away in an old hat box.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?